What is this? Well, it's a sponge, but not just any sponge. It's a sponge from the Greek island of Kalymnos. Now, you may be wondering, so what? Well, this Kalymnian gold right here brought the most economic and social development to the island of Kalymnos and concerns probably the most dangerous job around. Let's go back a bit, and I mean way back to antiquity. Famous Greeks such as Homer, Aristotle, and Plato described the sponge as an object that was used for bathing by rich people. Later, sponges were used for padding for helmets, drinking vessels, water filters, and contraceptives. So it can be safe to assume that sponges were pretty valuable. Now let's fast forward to 19th century AD. We're on the island of Kalymnos, but we find that only a small percentage of the land can be used for agriculture, something around only 20%. So, what do we do for money? Well, the only place we can look to for our salvation is the ocean. So, let's focus on building boats, fishing, and you guessed it, sponge diving. Remember when I said that this was probably the most dangerous job around? Let me explain. The first sponge diving technique that was ever employed was naked diving. Divers would hunt for sponges in small groups on boats. They would first try to identify the location of sponges with a glass-bottomed cylindrical tool. Once they've identified the location of the sponges, they would commence diving. Divers were, as the name suggests, naked. They were equipped with only a scythe and a mesh bag. They would hold onto a rope connected to a weighted stone called a scandalopetra, while the other end of the rope was tied to the boat. Now the purpose of the stone was to pull the diver to the ocean floor as fast as possible. So divers literally took a deep breath, dropped to the ocean floor, and started chopping away to deposit these sponges into their mesh bags. Once they have collected enough sponges, or feel that their lungs are about to burst, they would tug on the rope and the other divers on the boat would pull them out of the ocean. Now remember, there were no oxygen tanks back then, and apparently divers would go as deep as 30 meters and could hold their breath up to 5 minutes. Regardless of the dangers, this method brought forth an abundance of sponges, which in turn brought enormous wealth for the island of Kalymnos. Merchants made enormous profits from trade and export, and they became highly influential members of Kalymnian society. Let's fast forward to 1865, where the profession became even more hazardous. A new diving suit called the scafandro was introduced. With the help of the new suit, divers were able to go even deeper, as deep as 70 meters apparently, and through a hose there was a supply of air which came from a manual surface pump, meaning that divers could go deeper for longer. By this time, the sponge diving industry had grown immensely. In her book Bitter Sea, Faith Warren describes that in 1868, the sponge diving fleet consisted of 300 ships with 6 to 15 divers on each ship, 70 ships that harvested sponges with harpoons, and 70 trawlers. This was no longer a small business. This was an empire. But at what cost? Sure, these divers were making money for themselves, their families, and the island, but they were seriously putting their health at risk. It is estimated that 10,000 have died and 20,000 were permanently disabled due to something called decompression sickness. Remember the air supply that the new diving suit had? This compressed air that divers would breathe in would also carry nitrogen. In high pressure, the nitrogen goes into the body tissue, which is actually fine. If you ascend slow enough, the nitrogen will slowly leave the body through the lungs. But if you ascend too fast, the nitrogen creates bubbles in the bodies which can create injuries. And I mean severe injuries, such as tissue and nerve damage, paralysis, or if the bubbles form in the brain, death. This form of sponge diving was banned by the Ottoman Sultan at the time due to its obvious dangers. However, as profits plummeted, this ban was quickly lifted, which led to even more injuries and deaths. Let's fast forward again to the end of the Second World War. During this time, the sponge diving industry almost came to a complete halt. Hundreds of these divers resettled in new countries such as the USA and Australia. Though that being said, the sponge diving industry was still pushing along with a few hundred workers it had left. But at least now they understood the dangers of decompression sickness and started using oxygen tanks just like modern day scuba divers. All was going well until a terrible, fast-spreading blight almost wiped out all of the sponges in the East Mediterranean Sea. Synthetic sponges were introduced to keep the sponge industry afloat. However, these definitely are nowhere near as good as the real thing. So what about today? Well, the business is nowhere near as blooming as it once was. There's just not nearly as much demand as there was back in the day. The synthetic sponge has overwhelmed the market instead. Right now, it's estimated that there are only 80 sponge divers on the island today. There are maritime museums dedicated to the history of sponge diving, and there are still merchants who are still selling sponges today. I will say this though, one time I had a doctor's appointment with a Greek doctor from Kalymnos. I saw a whole row of sponges lined up on the shelf, and I asked him, "Are these sponges from Kalymnos?" And he says to me, "Well, this one's from the Caribbean, this one's from Africa, and so on and so on. But this sponge here from Kalymnos is the best sponge that I have." And he actually made me feel and smell each one of these sponges. And I have to agree, the sponge from Kalymnos was the best. Now hold on a minute, did you just say smell? You might think I'm crazy, but these sponges actually smell really good. I can literally smell the ocean. This sponge here is from my Greek Thea Katerina, who is obviously from Kalymnos, and it's honestly one of the best gifts I've ever been given. Will the sponge diving industry in Kalymnos die one day? For better or for worse? I think so. Sponge diving is a profession of the past. People are utilizing the assets in different fields of work now, but none of this changes the fact that these sponges are simply amazing.